Greetings, Arseblog viewers. I'm used to saying readers or listeners. Usually I do like a post-match video after an Arsenal women game at Meadow Park, usually from pitch side. Now, sometimes those post-match videos can be quite tricky to do for evening games. Usually when you're doing a kind of post-match stuff, you start to get the message that it's time to leave when they start turning the floodlights off and things like that. And that was happening while we were talking to Jonas last night. So I didn't really have an opportunity to do a kind of pitch side video, but actually, I don't think there's an awful lot else to say about the game over Brighton that I'm probably not going to cover already in the analysis piece, which will probably go up on the site on Sunday or Monday. Instead, I wanted to pick up on something that Jonas talked about. He was asked about, actually, by Art de Roche from The Athletic. Now, at the end of last season, the final game of last season at West Ham, Jonas was asked a question. It was something along the lines of, what do you want to improve in the team for next season, so this season now? And one of the things he identified was how Arsenal had struggled to play against teams that press player for player, particularly in the Champions League. So Arsenal had some tough results in the Champions League last season. Now, they played Barcelona twice because they were lucky enough to be drawn in a group with Barcelona, and they were beaten 4-1 and 4-0, which, to be fair, most teams would get beaten by Barcelona, albeit not Lyon in the final on this occasion. But also they played Wolfsburg in the quarter-final, and they were quite well beaten by Wolfsburg in the end. And Wolfsburg are another team who play player for player. They mark every player. And even Hoffenheim in the group stage. And Hoffenheim are a really good team in Germany, but a team, you know, Arsenal beat them 4-0 at home, but in the away leg, Arsenal lost 4-1. Slightly different circumstances around that game because Arsenal needed to not lose by 5 goals to qualify from the group, but still really, really poor performance, really poor result, and they really struggled because Hoffenheim are another team who go player for player, man marking, if you will, and if you'll forgive the gendered language around that, which hasn't quite evolved for women's football. I don't know why we don't just say woman for woman, actually. I think that would probably be easier. And that was one of the things that Jonas identified as Arsenal needing to improve against teams that really close you down and press every single player that receives the ball. And the issue is that not many teams in the WSL play like that. Maybe only Chelsea really play like that. So it's a challenge that Arsenal don't meet very often domestically. And so one of the things Jonas spoke to us about back in May was about talking to Per Mertesacker and using the opportunity to play against the boys' youth teams at Arsenal. Now, this is an approach that is quite, I wouldn't say old, but it's been happening for the last few years, really. And the teams that tend to do it, USA, women's national team, Barcelona have been doing it for the last 3 or 4 years or so. Lyon do it. Chelsea, I believe, have been doing it for the last year or so. I mean, you can pick up a theme in those names, perhaps. They're all really, really good. They're some of the best, you know, they're the best teams in Europe and the world. So Arsenal, what Jonas was really keen to do was to get Arsenal training against and playing training matches against the boys under-15, under-16 teams. And this is an approach that, like I say, lots of women's elite teams use because of some of the physical differences. Now, the way Jonas explained it to us, if you go much over under-17s, under-18s, the physical difference becomes too much. And effectively, there isn't much use in it for a women's team. But playing against like 15, 16, 17-year-olds, and generally what teams do, forgive the plane going overhead, can't do much about that. What teams tend to do is they progress through those kind of age groups as they get used to playing against boys. And obviously the idea is that physically it's more demanding. So like boys will close down space quicker, and things like that. And so Jonas's idea is that if Arsenal women can train against the under-15s, under-16 boys on a regular basis, that they'll be exposed to, you know, quicker, perhaps stronger players, but players that close down more quickly as well. Now, Arsenal played the Arsenal under-15s at the end of August. Unfortunately, the result was leaked by, I think, unwittingly, I think, by a member of the under-15 boys team. And you know, there's been a lot of cunts using it essentially as kind of you know, I guess weaponry against women's football. But the reason Jonas went into this a little bit on Friday night after the Brighton game, and really the idea, and it's not just playing against players who are, you know, slightly quicker, maybe slightly stronger, slightly quicker to close down, and exposing Arsenal to that approach a little bit more often. But he also explained it in terms of Arsenal's pressing as well. So one of the things they've gotten really good at under Jonas Eidevall, and you saw tons of this on Friday night, and I'm going to put it all in the analysis piece, is how quick Arsenal are to close teams down and really press them, counter-press them, keep them hemmed in. And Jonas also explained that he felt that playing against boys' teams would make that, so it's not just a case of what it's like when you're being pressed, but when you press as well. So he was talking about how the decision making has to be much sharper because, you know, young male athletes will close down space more quickly, and so being sharper on the ball, getting those passes off without taking a touch and things like that. So and he also talked about how that would help with structure, because he was talking about how when you want to become a pressing team, as he's transitioned Arsenal into over the last year, it's not just about your physical properties or your desire to get there. That's a big part of it. But he was talking about how your structure really matters, and what happens with the players behind the ball when you're attacking, and those players who have to be a bit like a coiled spring and think, right, if they clear this, or if they think they've cleared this, or they start to pass it out, or they break our first line of press, I've got to be in there really, really quickly. And that means I've got to be in the right position to do that. So he was talking about it not just in terms of the raw physical elements, but doing things like speeding up decision making, speeding up passing and things like that. And essentially over time, what tends to happen, the trend when elite women's teams play against junior boys teams, is they lose initially. And I'm sure people would have seen the result when the women played the under-15s in August. But what tends to happen over time is that the women start winning those games. So you look at Barcelona now. 3 or 4 years ago, they were losing to their junior boys teams. Now, Barcelona Femini play the under-18s at Barcelona, sorry, the under-17s, and they thrash them because they're used to it. They've had that exposure, they've had that practice. And when you watch Barca Femini, it's not just the speed with which they move the ball, but the speed with which they press you and win it back as well. And so over a number of years, what's really helped them with that approach is playing their junior boys teams. And this is a journey that Arsenal have just begun. So what I would expect, now, I wouldn't expect the results to come out too often, to be honest. And quite often these, I think in America they call them scrimmage games. So sometimes they are like 11-11 practice matches, as the one was when Arsenal played in August. But, you know, sometimes Jonas was saying as well, it doesn't have to be an 11v11 match. Sometimes it can just be training, maybe doing rondos and drills and things like that. And what you tend to find is that the results tick upwards. So Barca Femini 4 years ago were losing to their under-15s. Now they're thrashing the under-17s because they've come up to that physical level. And that's what it's all about. It's about the fact that kind of training against teenage boys, maybe not beyond the age of 17, 18, but that's not an unattainable physical level for a female athlete. However, compared to a lot of the opponents that these teams will play, it is a superior level. So, yeah, frankly, Arsenal's under-15s would probably beat a lot of teams in the WSL. They'd probably be physically superior at this stage. But what Arsenal are looking at is they're looking at raising the bar in training. And essentially the reason you'll start with under-15s is because probably after a couple of games, the women will beat the under-15s because their technical fundamentals are superior, their game knowledge, their game IQ, all of that is superior. It's just the physical element, but it's not an unattainable physical level, basically. That's the message. So what tends to start happening, I don't know for sure that this will happen with Arsenal, but I think it probably will, because this is the model other teams follow, is they'll probably play the under-15s a few times, they'll turn them over at some point, and then they'll go up to the under-16s, then the under-17s. And that's about the stage you really want to be at, I think. Again, this is what Barcelona Femini do quite a lot. But there are other benefits to it as well. And Jonas was talking about this last night. He was talking about how it also offers the opportunity just to network with the academy coaches and just to kind of exchange ideas and things like that, and really build like a club IQ. And if you think about it, you know, we know that like Manchester City and the City Group do this, for example, but you think about it, like a football club has all these teams, you know, the men's senior team, the under-23s, under-21s, under-18s, under-16s, you know, the women's team, the women's under-21 teams. And that's a lot of coaches who are on the same site every single day. And this is about them talking to each other a little bit more as well, and kind of building that expertise. And, you know, I don't think that there's loads and loads that Jonas Eidevall would take from like the under-15s coach, but if it's just one thing, and vice versa as well. So what you're doing there is you're building like a database of knowledge within your club. And another interesting move this summer that a lot of people probably won't know about is that the new strength and conditioning coach for the women's team, he moved across from the academy this summer. Pordy, his name is. So I can't remember if he was with the under-15s or under-16s, but he's moved across to the women's team. And again, that's just about promoting that kind of club IQ. And it's also good for the development of these coaches as well, to move around teams and expose themselves to different types of athletes, maybe different age groups, obviously different genders as well. So I think this is why Per Mertesacker, another one of the reasons Per Mertesacker is quite keen on it in terms of building that knowledge base at the club. But also, just in closing, I think one of the things that playing kind of the junior boys teams against women's teams does is it's really valuable for the junior boys teams as well. So it's valuable in an off the pitch respect. And you've probably heard Per Mertesacker talk about, you know, the importance of education and preparing these young men for the real world, particularly if they don't make it as footballers, which most of them won't. And one of the things this does is kind of teaches, I think, respect for female colleagues. And that's something that, you know, probably a lot of 14, 15-year-old boys aren't really taught. I know I wasn't when I was that age. I had to unlearn a lot of shit, frankly, and I'm certainly still am. And it really kind of, I think, engenders that kind of respect for their female colleagues. But also it teaches them something as well. And this is what I mean about, now, look, probably when the teams played each other in August, I'm not sure how much the under-15 boys would have learned from that game. But when they play each other more, they will. Because what the women's team have is experience of competition 3 times a week. They're professionals. They play meaningful games. They play Champions League games. They compete for league titles. They play in cup finals. You know, Arsenal women have the captain of the England women's team who just won the Euros in front of 90,000 people at Wembley. Arsenal women have the player of the tournament and the golden boot winner from that tournament, who did all of that in front of tens of thousands of people. Those are experiences that our boys teams will not have yet. And that's really, really valuable as well. And one of the things I remember reading a couple of years ago, again, another one of these stupid stories about how like the US women's national team had lost to the Dallas under-15s, which I think is disputed anyway, because it wasn't a match, it was a scrimmage, as they call it. But afterwards, there are photos of a lot of the boys having their photos taken with people like Tobin Heath, Heather O'Reilly, because these are massive, massive figures in the US where, you know, women's football is so popular, and these players who won World Cups and won Olympic golds, and all of these boys afterwards were there getting photos taken with them, getting shirts signed and things like that. So that shows you what they thought of playing these players, regardless of whether they beat them or not. They were kind of in awe of some of these players who they'd watched win cup finals, World Cup finals on television, and I think that's really, really useful as well. So it's not just useful for the women's teams. It's useful for the boys' teams as well, and particularly to see some of those technical fundamentals that probably women's players will have. And that's what you'll start to see, that once the women's team comes up to the physical level, they'll start to turn these teams over because of things like that. So it's a give and take relationship essentially, and I think I just wanted to put that in a bit of a video as an explainer, not least because it's something that Jonas brought up on Friday evening.